Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tammy Wilson, and I am the project lead at the California Dyslexia Initiative. I'm going to start over. Good afternoon. I'm Tammy Wilson. I'm a director at the Sacramento County Office of Education, and I am the project lead on the California Dyslexia Initiative. We are really excited to have so many friends and colleagues join us for this learning opportunity. Welcome to the 23-24 CDI Expert Webinar Series. As you may know, in this series, we are learning more about the International Dyslexia Association's updated graphic on structured literacy instruction, really focusing in on what educators need to know about the content and principles of a high-quality structured literacy approach grounded in the science of reading. For today's webinar, we're excited to feature the dynamic educator, Dr. Margie Gillis. And to support our attendees, we've created a Padlet, which will host the slides, as well as a companion document that you can use. That it includes discussion prompts and some additional resources that you may want to explore. The Sacramento County Office of Education is the project lead on the Dyslexia Initiative, and one of our goals is to provide professional opportunities just like this one within the system of support across California to build knowledge, skill, and capacity around teaching and supporting students who are at risk for reading difficulties, as well as those that have dyslexia. We're delighted to partner with our friends at Glean to provide this expert webinar series. And it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to my friend and colleague, Jessica Hammond, founder and CEO of Glean Education, who's coordinating our efforts in this webinar series. Jessica.
Thank you, Tammy. We are thrilled to partner with SCOE and the California Dyslexia Initiative to coordinate this webinar series for the third year in a row. For those of you who may not know about us, we are Glean Education, and we partner with schools, districts, and states to deliver online training, school leader consulting, and web-based structured literacy coaching. Our work aims to build educator knowledge of evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. Next slide, please. This is our 6th in a series of webinars this year on structured literacy and dyslexia. If you haven't registered for the final webinar in the series, that will be next month, we'll be popping the registration link in the chat, so be sure not to miss it. For this webinar, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Margie Gillis. Margie Gillis is a nationally recognized literacy expert and certified academic language therapist who has been teaching children of all ages to read for over 40 years. In 2009, Margie founded Literacy How to provide professional development opportunities and coaching for teachers on how to best implement evidence-based reading practices in the classroom. Margie has worked at the policy level through the Connecticut State Department of Education. She was instrumental in Connecticut's adoption of a universal screening test for K-3 students, implementing Connecticut's Foundations of Reading test as a part of the certification process for pre-service teachers, and for the design and execution of the Connecticut K-3 Literacy Initiative. Margie was recently a member of the Department of Education's SLD Dyslexia Workgroup. Please help us welcome Dr. Margie Gillis. Oh, Margie, you're on mute real quick.
Yeah, I was just trying to find that mute button. So thank you, Jessica. Thank you for your introduction, Tammy as well. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for putting some information in the chat so I know who's here today. I had psychologists, a couple of people from higher education, special ed teachers, learning specialists, like a librarian, wonderful reading interventionist. So welcome people from elementary, middle, and I think some secondary teachers as well. My talk, as Jessica said, structured literacy to support students with dyslexia, and just a very extra bit of background from you know, where I come from. I actually started out as a special education teacher many years ago, celebrating 50 years actually this year. And I really have always been interested in dyslexia. I have a brother who never knew he was dyslexic until he was an adult. Similarly, a husband who never knew he was dyslexic until he was an adult, a child who's an adult now, and 3 grandchildren. 2 out of 3 are dyslexic. So I not only study this and really have been interested in it, worked with students of all ages for many years, but I also have a personal, very deep personal connection to the field. I was a teacher for 25 years, and then I became a research translator when I was at Haskins Laboratories for 10 years, from 2000 to 2009. And then I started Literacy How, a not-for-profit organization, in 2009. Our mission is to empower teachers because we believe that the teacher is the key variable in getting a student to read successfully. Programs matter, certainly, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about structured literacy today, but the teacher is really the most important factor in kids' success. And this is our Literacy How reading wheel that just depicts all the core components of literacy. We have a lot of information on our website that you see here, so hopefully you take a look later. So today I have 3 primary objectives. First, I want to talk about the current definition of dyslexia and some suggested revisions from experts in the field. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the implications for instruction, and that's really important based on what the experts are saying about dyslexia and the complexity of that. I want to talk about what does instruction need to look like for students that struggle with reading. And then my third objective is to talk about structured literacy instruction to support these students with dyslexia. Before I launch into my first objective, though, since I was a special education teacher, and I know I have several special education teachers on this webinar, I want to just reveal this data that comes from a study that is titled Characterizing the Knowledge of Educators Across Tiers of Instructional Support. It appeared in the Annals of Dyslexia a couple of years ago. Porter and Dr. Tim Odegaard was also somebody who worked on this study, looking at special education teachers' knowledge about the structure of language. And this is a fairly large N study with 1,574 teachers. Most of the teachers were gen ed teachers, but they also looked at disaggregating data by the role that the teachers played, and they survey these teachers on a fairly rigorous assessment of knowledge. And as it says here, the students that had the most significant reading difficulties worked with special education teachers who had the most limited knowledge, below reading interventionists and classroom teachers. And this is no fault of special education teachers. It's really the system that I believe is not preparing them adequately. And that cuts across all roles, but I wanted to highlight specifically special education teacher, since I was that teacher for many years, and I really appreciate how important it is that you, the special ed teacher, have this knowledge. So as I talk about the research a little bit more, I know most of you have seen this graphic by Hollis Scarborough, which, even though she didn't develop it to do so, it really does a nice job of depicting the simple view of reading, as we know, which is the product of decoding or word recognition and language comprehension, resulting in skilled reading. And we see that it takes a while for that skilled reading to develop. We say 3 years before we can see how these strands get interwoven, because English has a very deep, complex orthography, which I'll talk more about in a bit. But that simple view is really used to also think about profiles of readers. And I'm going to keep coming back to this as we talk through this webinar, because it really does a nice job of putting students into one of 4 categories. They're broad, and I'll speak to that as well. But you have skilled readers who have good word recognition as well as good listening comprehension. And actually, this is reverse. I just noticed that. So pardon this, that I changed the order for a reason that you'll see later. But this should say poor, and this should say good, and I'll correct those slides. I just picked up on that. So good, skilled readers have good word recognition, good listening comprehension. Dyslexic readers have poor listening sorry, this is all backwards. My apologies, I should have picked up on this. But dyslexics, yes, have poor word recognition, but good listening comprehension. And we'll go back to this in a bit because I'm sorry, this is confusing me and I don't want it to confuse you either. Actually, it looks like it's right, except these two boxes are mixed up. So this skilled reader should come up here. Can you see my cursor, Jessica? Okay. And this group should come down here. All right. So this is right. Dyslexics have poor word recognition, good listening comprehension. And then we have students who have mixed reading disability with poor word recognition and poor listening comprehension. And that's right. Okay. Whew. All right, let's keep going. So to that end, thinking about dyslexia and the definition of dyslexia, we'll talk about these different definitions that come from a variety of organizations, and each one has a different focus, as I mentioned up here, just some of those organizations that have defined dyslexia. But what I want to look at in more detail is the definition that was adopted 22 years ago by the International Dyslexia Association, has been widely recognized ever since. And this is the definition, and I've highlighted certain pieces of this definition that I'm going to take and discuss in greater detail. The fact that it's neurological, which I know most of you are aware of, the fact that these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component, that there are secondary consequences, etc. So let's talk first about the neurobiology of the reading brain, right? The fact that it's neurobiological in origin. And we know this because we have really great technology now that looks at the structure of the brain, usually with MRI technology that looks at the gray matter and the white matter. And then we can also look at the function of the brain. And that basically tells us where and when with EEG and technology like that. And this is really important because we can see areas of the brain that light up: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. All of these areas of the brain contribute to the neurocircuitry that does not come for free, not like language. We can learn language without being explicitly taught, but the brain has to develop these circuits to get skilled reading. And I have in the reference list at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, Kearns et al., a great research article about the neurobiology of reading, describing this in greater detail. And this slide showing the brain patterns that dyslexic students may show, right, where they're activating the frontal lobes versus the occipital temporal region, which we know is the signature region that we see here in non-dyslexic students, right? That shows that the student is reading fluently, that they have developed good sight word recognition and orthographic processing that's working efficiently. So I want to highlight a really important article, and this is in your reference section also, that talks about revisiting the definition of dyslexia. And I'm going to highlight a few of these things today because I think they're relevant for instruction. And I know 99% of you on this attending this webinar are really interested in what are the implications for instruction. Hugh Katz, among other giants in the field, including Nicole Patton-Terry, Dr. Don Compton, Rick Wagner, contributed to this article, basically thinking about how important it is that we understand this neurological basis, because we confuse sometimes causes and consequences of dyslexia. Also, the characterization of neurobiological basis as a disorder or deficit. The consensus was that that should be avoided as it is in current definitions. So again, going back to that idea of word recognition as being what dyslexics struggle most with, we want to also highlight the fact that dyslexia impacts this word reading ability, but that it's distributed among along a continuum from very weak to strong. Also, that the nature of these word reading challenges vary depending on the orthography of the language. So of course, we're talking about English, but dyslexia looks different in transparent languages like Spanish and Italian and Finnish. Because the English language is regarded as having a deep or opaque orthography, it makes it much more challenging for our students to not only read it, but even more so to write and spell. It also impacts accuracy and speed, as we know. And the other thing that's really important to remember is that this presence of phonological processing challenges that we see in many dyslexics, if not most, makes word reading even more challenging. So as we think about the sort of revisiting the definition of dyslexia, we're going to think about multiple risk factors. And the first person that I've highlighted here is Dr. Tim Odegaard, who wrote an article for Perspectives issue devoted to dyslexia in 2019. It's an excellent article. And in his particular article, it's an excellent issue. In his particular article, he focused on the fact that there is not a single cognitive profile that fits all dyslexics, right? That there are multiple differing profiles that have been linked to the word level reading problems. And sort of adding to that, the article that I just referenced by Katz et al. Talks about these multiple risk factors that work in conjunction to increase the probability of difficulties in learning to read, rather than one factor or combination. But the other thing that's listed here, or that's referenced here, is that the risk can be moderated by positive influences that serve as protective or promotive factors to counteract risk factors. And that's important because those positive influences include good instruction, right? They also include, a feeling of determination and perseverance that many students that struggle happen to have, which is a tremendous protective factor. I know there's a lot here, and I'm not going to, really talk about all of it, other than the fact that I want you to look at this, idea that there are possible causes of reading difficulty and what the relationship to dyslexia is. So one possible cause is this phonological deficit that is present in many dyslexics. Then there's this general difficulty, right, with cognitive functioning that impacts learning to read. We know about attention and emotional difficulties that also can contribute. But I also want to focus on this bottom one, this limited evidence-based word reading instruction, right? This could be the reason why students haven't developed good word reading ability. And what is its relationship to dyslexia? We know that if students are not dyslexic, they're likely to improve with good instruction pretty quickly. If they're not responding, it is probably a good indicator that that student is at risk for dyslexia. So we want to just be aware of that and pay close attention to that. So just adding a little bit more description and specificity to this idea of secondary consequences and comorbidity. Again, this comes from the article by Katz et al. Thinking about individuals with dyslexia facing academic challenges rooted in many cases, phonological processing. But they also, many face non-academic challenges, including poor self-esteem, anxiety, depression, and those will result in negative consequences. And the last bullet, talking about the fact that dyslexia often co-occurs with other developmental conditions, including a speech language disorder, developmental language disorder, ADHD, and a math disorder. So that's just going to add to the complexity of treating students with dyslexia. It's not going to be as simple and straightforward when there are multiple things going on. And I want to highlight some work that's being done by Dr. Tiffany Hogan. This is a webinar that she did a few months ago, actually 2 months ago in January for Learning Ally, and you can get the recording. I highly recommend that you listen to it to learn more about the comorbidity of dyslexia with developmental language disorder. And Tiffany is a giant, another giant in the field. She is at Mass General Institute of Health Professions. She also has an organization called DLD and Me. So dldandme.org. I didn't include it in my reference list, so make sure you jot that down, and somebody I'm sure will put it in the chat for you. She has really been focused on highlighting this group of students who have difficulties with word recognition, and sorry, they're good at word recognition. They have difficulties with language comprehension. And there's in that box in the past, we might have seen students with ASD, right? Autism spectrum disorder, kids with SLI, specific language impairment, students with specific comprehension difficulties. Tiffany is making a case for coming up with, a term that kind of embraces those students that have those challenges, and also notes that we used to think that dyslexia and DLD or SLI were mutually exclusive. We now know that you can be dyslexic and have difficulties with DLD, and that's really important, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. As I talk about what are the implications for instruction for students with dyslexia, but also students that have dyslexia because there are quite a few students that have difficulties with both. So just again, quickly reviewing these common poor reading profiles, thinking about the fact that each broad ability includes numerous component abilities. So even within those broad categories, we have to differentiate instruction for those students. And they'll support instructional design that is actionable, involving skills that can be improved with appropriate instruction. But it's really important to think about this as a first pass, and that when you figure out that students get sort of sorted into those groups, we need to do more diagnostic assessments to really get to the appropriate instruction they need. I reference here Louise Spear-Swirling's book that will be released at the end of this month. I was able to read it ahead of time, and it's amazing. Structured Literacy Planner, published by Guilford Press. Lots of great practical information in this book that I know most of you will appreciate. And she talks about these common profiles, and she has this great table where she looks at the profile in each profile, and she looks at different behaviors associated with those profiles. So one of them is, what does their out of context word reading look like? That's something we want to look at closely. We also want to look at their oral vocabulary and comprehension, because again, many students struggle with this in this area as well. We look at their text reading fluency, because all dyslexics are not created equal, even in terms of how fluently they read, although most struggle. Looking at their reading comprehension, so how well do they comprehend as they're reading something? And then some examples of underlying causes that I think are really practical for teachers. And then last but not least, what would their interventions need? Again, needs be based on the profiles that I just described. All right, so I'm going to bounce back to an article, to the article, the Cats et al. Article. And I'm just going to read this quote that speaks to the persistence of reading and spelling difficulties. For children with dyslexia, it is expected that without early, intensive, and ongoing intervention, word reading, decoding, and spelling problems will persist even into adulthood. Even with such instruction, children with dyslexia may continue to experience some difficulties, especially in spelling. And I highlight that as, again, this article has so much information in it, but I highlight this because a lot of people will say, well, why are we bothering to teach them to spell if they're never going to be good at spelling? And the reason is because, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, spelling really is reciprocal to the word reading intervention work that we're going to be doing, and it really will continue to support students' reading fluency as well as other skills. And I want to highlight in this section the importance of assessment. And in Dr. Hogan's webinar, she talks about the fact that even for kids who are red flags for dyslexia because of phonological processing difficulties that they present with even in the early years, like in preschool and kindergarten, but we might not miss the DLD diagnosis in those early years, because guess what? We're not screening kids for language difficulties. By and large, we don't have good screeners for that. So we can't ignore those red flags. And this slide comes from the webinar as well. And I put this here because we have a history of for letting kids wait to fail. Dr. Nadine Gaab talks about the dyslexia paradox. And as you can see here, the window of opportunity for finding all kids with difficulty, including dyslexia and DLD, is in the pre-K, first grade, 3-year period. Even if we wait till second to third grade, doesn't seem too late, it's still going to have more negative consequences. So early intervention, early screening is so very, very important. This is really prevention, whereas this is more oriented to treatment. And just to quote Dr. Odegaard, there may be a research justification for a new definition, which we've talked about, but he's going to drive home the point here about instruction, saying there's a much bigger need to support thoughtful, clear plan to elevate the level of reading instruction for all children, because true north goes through every classroom, and we must never return to a day in which we blame children who are struggling to read for the shortcomings of adults to provide them with what they actually need. So that sort of segues me into this slide where I want to now talk about structured literacy. And in the graphic that you're going to see, it kind of cuts off the top of the graphic, or maybe it's at the bottom, I can't remember. But I really want to focus for a moment on the who in the structured literacy graphic. We have the who, the what, and the how. The who is really all students and being instructed by all teachers in all tiers of instruction, understanding that these teachers must understand dyslexia and how to use elements and principles of structured literacy instruction as they teach the what and the how. So we're going to find kids with dyslexia and DLD in all classrooms. So the first line of defense is making sure tier 1 is strong. And then, of course, beyond tier 1, we have to make sure our tier 2 and tier 3 teachers, our special education teachers, our interventionists have even more knowledge and deeper knowledge. So thank you all, for those of you who serve in those roles, for being here today. Before I talk about structured literacy instruction, I want to spend just a minute describing non-structured literacy instruction. So here are the bullets that I kind of want to focus on. That skills and concepts are generally not explicitly taught in a balanced or non-structured literacy classroom. There's a lack of a systematic scope and sequence to actually guide the instructions. There's limited guided practice to ensure concepts are learned. So kids might practice something once or twice and then the teacher moves on. And we know that doesn't net the best result. We also see differences in terms of the types of assessments that are used for diagnostic and progress monitoring, students' instruction, and the fact that they're not measuring skill development and mastery the way that we suggest that we do in structured literacy approach. Students also read level text and prompted to use context clues versus decoding strategies in a balanced literacy classroom. And students spend more time reading independently versus reading, orally with the teacher. And that way kids can kind of skate through and teachers will not know that they're struggling with word reading and fluency. And lastly, text selection is often driven by interest versus instructional needs. Certainly we want kids to be interested and motivated in what they're reading, but if they can't read, that's off the table. So instructional needs need to take precedence over interest, at least initially. And so just driving home the point of how important intervention is and how important your work as reading teachers and interventionist special ed teachers is, this idea that we have demonstrated through research that actually we change the activation patterns in the brain. Teachers can change brains as a result of the reading intervention that we use. And this is independent. This is evident not only in the neurological changes that we see, but also in our students' reading behaviors. So my third objective, and where I'll spend the last 25 minutes or so this afternoon, is to talk about structured literacy. What is it? And I know you all are familiar with it, but I'm going to focus on mostly today on some of the what's that I think are really important based on what I just talked about earlier, and just one of the hows. So you've seen, I believe, this infographic, which I love, from IDA, and all these, this content that we've divided here from the word recognition side of the simple view and comprehension side of the simple view. And what I love also that's been added is this idea of handwriting, which we don't always talk about, right? We certainly don't talk about it in the simple view, and composition over here. And then we've also added in critical thinking. And I'll have a slide at the end talking about the integration. So referencing Louise Spear-Swerling's book again, the way that it's divided, which I think is actually very effective, is that she talks about these different profiles that I've just reviewed with you, but she also divides each profile into early and advanced. And I think that's very helpful, because even though we have kids, and I know we have teachers today tuning in that have students in middle and high school, they may be considered early readers. Early readers isn't the age of the reader, but rather it's where they are in that continuum. And in this case, in the continuum of being skilled word readers. So this is a very broad, general kind of lesson plan structure, so that you can get an idea of a flow of what the instruction might look like for early readers. It's going to, of course, focus heavily on word recognition and spelling, but those two go hand in hand because they're reciprocal skills. So the students would be warming up with the phonemic awareness activity. They're going to review their sound spelling correspondences depending on what they're working on. They're going to review their spelling generalizations, the syllable patterns they've learned, and then they're going to get into decoding and encoding practice, as well as practicing reading irregular words. And then, of course, we want to continue to build on their fluency by having them read words and phrases for accuracy and automaticity, and preparing them to be able to read a text, right? So a book or a passage, and always with a focus on comprehension. So we're going to continue to think about the words they're reading. If there's vocabulary in that text that they may not be familiar with, making sure they spend time on that, and then asking especially open-ended questions that would generate inferencing. And then last but not least, we want to make sure in every lesson they're writing something, even if it's just one word, if that's all they have time for, but ideally a structured dictation to practice their spelling words and writing sentences. And we pull those words and sentences right out of the text so that we almost can think about a backwards planning phenomenon. You know what text you're going to have the kids read. So that's your, that's what you're going to pull the PA warm up from. That's what you're going to pull the syllable patterns, the fluency practice, the word and phrase walks, etc. All of that's going to come from the text that you're going to ultimately have them read and prepare and scaffold them to read. And as we talk about this, I want to spend just a minute making sure that we understand the distinction between a speech to print and a print to speech approach, because we're advocating for going from speech to print. What the student comes into the world hearing words and language, right? They know those words, they've heard them. So we're going to link the unknown, right? The print to what they've heard. And we do this through engaging activities, making sure kids are attending to the sound structure of the words. And this is a quote that comes from an article that Janine Herron and I co-wrote a few years ago, and the reference is in the bibliography or in the reference section of this slide presentation. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about spelling, because again, spelling is something that most dyslexics, if not all, struggle with. And we want to make sure that it's at the heart of every lesson. And so thinking about how we want to coordinate reading and spelling instruction, it says here, transfer to spelling, from spelling to reading, was greater than transfer from reading to spelling. That suggests that spelling practice actually establishes more detailed and accurate orthographic representation than does practice reading. So that indicates instruction in spelling may be particularly valuable in the early school years to aid in developing reading skills. And of course, we know that unfortunately, spelling isn't taught optimally in Tier 1. So we're just making a case for how important it is that teachers, even in Tier 1 instruction, are teaching spelling patterns. And they're thinking about the word study much more explicitly as far as being a multilinguistic intervention. I see a lot of teachers doing word study, and that's great. But what they're having kids do oftentimes is having them sort words visually. They're not necessarily having kids reading those words after they've sorted and asking them to think about what they're hearing as they're reading the words and linking the phonology to the orthography and the patterns. That's so very important. It also helps with reading fluency, which of course is one really important reason for doing word study. And then reflecting on the meanings of the words, and if there are morphological elements in those words, of course we're going to make sure the kids are paying attention to that. So this multilinguistic approach, many of you have seen the 4-part processor model. So I put it here as a reminder that we're linking, right, the orthography, the letters to the sounds. integrally related to the meaning of the words, and of course, in a specific content. So driving home and emphasizing that spelling depends on the knowledge of language, from the phonological form to the orthographic form to the semantics, the meaning, as we see here. And then last but not least, its morphological structure and grammatical role that we're not going to really understand fully unless we bring the context, the sentence, into the equation. And I can't have a discussion of spelling and orthography and reading fluently and sight word recognition without speaking about Linnea Airy's work for just a moment. I love the idea of sight word acquisition as a connection forming process, because every word that becomes a sight word is in our lexicon and becomes automatically retrieved when we link or connect the word spelling, right? B-O-W. It could be bow or it could be bow, right? We have to have the context, right? To know that we're talking about the bow of a boat. So orthography, phonology, semantics. One of my favorite activities for supporting students' orthographic mapping so that they'll turn every word into a sight word is sound letter mapping. And this is a great activity or strategy to use with our early readers, where we're really linking decoding and encoding. I'm sure, I would imagine that most everyone here has seen this activity, but I'll just take a moment to describe it. We have little chips that are at the top of this grid, right? Doesn't matter what color they are. We're going to say a word, gasp, and we'll put it in a sentence. I had to gasp for air. We're going to pull a chip down for each sound, g, a, s. We're going to slash the trash. Kids think that's really funny. Slash the trash, any box that's not used. Kids will pull down a chip if it's there. So we want to let them know, well, I only heard 4 sounds, only needed 4 chips. And then we're going to push each chip up and write the grapheme associated with that phoneme or sound. And then we're always going to write the word over here, right? Because we're going to make sure that the kids, after they've mapped, that they're going to read these words as fluently as possible, accurately, automatically. And this is not a map for novice readers. So unless they've learned all these patterns, but I wanted to just show you sort of what does a blend look like, right? Versus a digraph versus a trigraph versus vowel consonant E pattern. So there's lots of, oh, and this should have had a, sorry, this should have had a /2 through it. One of my favorite activities. Now, moving to advanced readers. So how might their instruction look different from the early readers? You're going to have similar flow for the lesson plan. You're going to start with word recognition and you're going to link spelling there. But in this case, where our advanced readers have mastered all the syllable patterns, we're going to include suffixes because presumably they've learned inflectional endings at the very least. We're going to make sure that most of the words that they're going to be reading are going to be multisyllabic words. So we're going to make sure they know how to divide those multisyllabic words, still focusing and reinforcing those syllable patterns that they've learned. And of course, spelling those multisyllabic words as well. Fluency practice is absolutely integral to their lesson plan as well. They're going to continue to review irregular words because by and large, there's some students that continue to struggle with some of those irregular words that need some practice. They're going to do repeated reading practice and other types of practice for fluency. And of course, they're going to do text reading. And their text will be, you know, it'll vary between being a decodable text that's very structured to less so. So Flyleaf has really great decodable texts that are what we call hybrid texts, because they have more multisyllabic words and words that might not fit the patterns as well. They're going to also do comprehension work as that we always do, and then lots of writing too, and making sure they can write those multisyllabic words. One of the articles that I included in your reference is an article by Kearns and Whaley. It's a great article that focuses on how to teach syllables and morphemes when you're teaching students to read multisyllabic words. And this is just a screenshot from the article that sort of talks about these steps that you're going to take in teaching this. This is a very, very practical article that I think teachers will appreciate. So they're going to look for suffixes that they know. They're going to basically define the suffix, or define its meaning. FUL says full. Every syllable has a vowel. Plen has a vowel that says plen. They could even identify it as a closed syllable. TI has a vowel that says tie, or tie. And then you say plentiful. Ah, I know a word like that. Plentiful, right? So they have to shift the vowel to a different, flex the vowel or shift the vowel, and explains how to teach that. And it's very, very practical. I want to also mention, because fluency is so important in working with all students with dyslexia and other difficulties too, because reading comprehension is difficult for almost all students who struggle with reading. There's an article that appeared in, I forget what journal it was, but it's in your reference section, and it talks about motivation for reading. Shanahan has talked a lot about motivation and fluency, and this quote comes from him: "One of the strongest supports that can be provided for reading text is oral reading fluency practice, so that students can always be practicing and applying their decoding skills." And the article that I'm referencing also comes from this researcher. I don't know how you pronounce her name, Mahigan. It's Irish. It's a study that was conducted in Irish primary schools with students that had reading difficulties. And her quote here: "In order for struggling readers to overcome skill deficiencies in reading and to be motivated to continue to read, it's imperative that any negative achievement-related self-beliefs are simultaneously addressed." And I just happened on this article when I was looking for another workshop that I was preparing for, and I really, really liked it for many reasons. What was most powerful about the article was that we saw a great impact on oral reading fluency and motivation when that was very explicitly acknowledged. So these ratings that you see come from support teachers, as well as student self-reports, as well as parent reports. It's not listed here, but this is using FORI, which is fluency-oriented reading instructions, basically things echo reading, partner reading, repeated reading, developed by Melanie Kuhn many years ago and her colleagues. And, this quote, it was like someone unlocked the doors of the reading kingdom for children, turned on the lights, invited them to the party, and they came, and more importantly, they stayed. So the article really describes very nicely how they incorporated motivation, self-efficacy, interest in reading, etc., into their fluency-oriented reading instruction. So I wanted to just acknowledge that. So shifting from the what, and as I said, I really focus specifically, I think, on spelling and fluency, but I know you've done a lot of work or heard a lot of presenters talk about some of those what elements. I do want to talk for just a couple minutes as we're wrapping up the hour, and maybe I'll have a few minutes for Q&A if there's any questions that have come about, is to talk about the how. And the one part of the how that I don't hear talked about as much, we talk about explicit, cumulative, multimodal, all these things, but this whole idea of planned, purposeful, instructional decisions for tasks and text, which I think is such a wonderful addition to these principles. And here are some things that I just want to call out to you all as teachers. We believe wholeheartedly that students with dyslexia, especially those early readers, benefit from code-focused texts because the texts follow a scope and sequence, and then you, the teacher, can plan your tasks, what you're going to ask kids to do with that text based on what the students know and what you're explicitly teaching them to learn and practice. And using the code-focused text, as I mentioned earlier, as the end goal, so that you can backwards plan the lesson based on that. So prior to reading the text as a whole, one of the things we do is a word and phrase walk. We pull words out of the text, phrases out of the text, and we do, like, you can even put them into rapid naming charts, because kids really benefit from practicing words ahead of time and scaffolding the words that might be difficult for them, or the grammatical phrases that might be difficult for them. And then they'll be able to read the text more fluently. And this whole idea of using phrase cued reading to support students' prosody, it also supports their syntactic awareness. And syntactic awareness is critically important for students to be able to make meaning of text. Last thing I want to mention is two more things to mention. Something called executive function, which you all are familiar with. There's overlap, as we know, between executive function and ADHD. And we know that students with dyslexia are often have comorbidity with ADHD/executive function. It's been estimated to be 25 to 40% comorbidity between the two. So we're just wanting to think about the implications, especially for reading comprehension. And this book that I put in your reference section as well is very practical ideas for supporting students' problems with attention and these cognitive processes that we talk about here. They really specifically impact reading comprehension. So when we think about structured literacy, and structured literacy really not just encompassing phonology, orthography, but also the semantics, the syntax, right? Discourse that students really need to continue to practice, even if they become decent readers, word readers. And so as we wrap up today, I also want to think about this idea of multi-componential instruction that I heard Marianne Wolf speak at the Plain Talk conference back in the end of January. And she kept talking about multi-componential instruction, which really just means that we're going to integrate PA and phonics, vocabulary, syntax, right, across content areas. So ELA, bringing all those components into our ELA, but not just ELA, our social studies classes, our math classes, our science classes. And this is an article that Nancy Eberhardt and I wrote for a recent issue in Perspectives. Overarching goal, obviously, the main reason we're doing all this work is so that our students can be skilled comprehenders and writers. And then Jessica wrote a wonderful piece for Perspectives that just came out, hot off the press. You can find it on the IDA website. I think it's a bonus that they're allowing even non-members to access. And this I cannot say enough about how comprehensive and informative this particular issue is. And what Jessica really focused on here is all the hallmarks of an integrated structured literacy approach, some of which I talked about today, not as much on this last bullet point, where we're really wanting to focus on meaning through vocabulary, comprehension, instruction, while listening and or reading at the word, sentence, paragraph, and text level. So we're really wanting to always think about how we integrate the structure of language with reading and writing instruction. So here's my list of resources. There are many more than these, but these are some of my favorites, and references that I also mentioned throughout the webinar, and some more here. So I know you needed a couple minutes for wrapping this up, and then if we have a couple minutes left for Q&A, we can do that as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Gillis. And that was an amazing presentation, chock full of amazing resources. So thank you for all that. I will share a little bit about the companion document. This is something that we've created to accompany each webinar, and it includes prompts for discussion after attending these webinars and additional resources. So do check them out. We will put the link in the chat as well. And you can find it at scoe.net/CA Dyslexia. And next slide, please. We also have a professional learning network that CDI is hosting. You can register at the link in the chat. And lastly is our survey that we would love for you to fill out today, as we're asking a final question or two. I believe we have time for at least one of them. So we'll put that link in the chat. Please do fill it out as we're closing out. Okay, so the first question we got was actually about the definition for dyslexia early on. And the question was, if you have an individual with reading difficulties, with deficits that have been targeted as being in orthographic processing, but not necessarily phonological processing, would they still be characterized as dyslexic?
Absolutely. And you're in luck, because you're going to be, you're going to have your last webinar is going to be with Nancy Mather, Dr. Nancy Mather, who's going to speak specifically about orthographic processing. And that's really interesting and coming up more and more lately, that we see students that have intact phonological processing, and phonological memory is pretty okay, phonological naming speed, phonological awareness, and they're really struggling, and it happens to be more with the orthographic processing. So why I always now focus a lot on spelling, those students need even more intervention around spelling. And it's as I said, those three links, those three sides of the triangle, right? The phonology, the orthography, the meaning are all linked together. So you can't really separate them, but you'll see if you attend the webinar with Dr. Mather, she'll really walk you through a lot of examples of orthographic difficulties, and absolutely they would be considered dyslexic, because it impacts more spelling than word reading, but it impacts both. And fluency is absolutely impacted as well. And it's just not as prevalent as the phonological processing difficulties.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll just ask one more question. Can you expand on the benefits of repeated reading? The participant said, David Kilpatrick in his book on assessment and interventions has said it has limited benefit because kids seem to learn by reading by heart. Can you discuss maybe what the research points to in terms of its benefits?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question too, and one that I've often thought about, because we do have some research that speaks to and shows evidence that repeated reading works, but I think it has to be coupled with other types of fluency practice. So I agree there's a place for it. I think it's motivating when the kids graph their improvement with repeated reading, and the interventions that I've seen that have been most impactful is when they do a cold read, they graph their their score with a passage they've never seen before. They read it several times, and they get excited to see their words correct per minute increase. So that's motivating. I think that's part of where it has its benefits. But echo reading, choral reading, partner reading, I think those are also really, really important because again, it's not to memorize the text or to get faster per se, it's to become more prosodic as they read so that they can be making meaning. I mean, that's part of what you're trying to convey to the kids. It's not about being faster, it's about being able to think about what they're reading. And the fact that they can do that more fluently allows them that cognitive energy that gets swept away when you're tripping over the words.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was amazing and a wonderful, wonderful presentation. All we have time for today. So I want to thank you for your time, Dr. Gillis, on behalf of Glean
pleasure.
Education, the Sacramento County Office of Education, and the California Dyslexia Initiative. Thank you to our attendees who visited today. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar with Dr. Nancy Mather on orthography as an element of structured literacy and assessment on March 14th. Oh, nope, that's April. Some date in April. I believe it's April 16th, perhaps, but we will get the right date in the chat. April 11th. Thank you, Wynn. Please register for that. Link is now in the chat. All right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. And thank you,
Take
Dr.
care.
Gillis.
Take care.